All right, we're gonna shift into color palettes. Colors, oh, I don't know what color to choose. There's so many color palette ideas, and a couple of my favorites, colorlovers.com is a really great one. But if you go to Pinterest, if you're one of the Pinterest junkies, or just go to Pinterest, search on color palette, and I mean, there is no end of ideas of inspiration. Color Lovers does this neat thing where it actually will take things from your world, like magazines or products, and it'll take the color palettes and actually extract them to something that you might want to use. So Color Lovers, Pinterest. In the aqua case, we said we wanted watery, and so some lily pads, and we thought those kind of seemed watery. So I'm going to switch into this, and I'm going to open aqua. Oh, there's the grid for aqua. See, this one is actually built for the wide, so using the same thing there. All right, so the color palette, there are the two uploaded images. And so here are those two images. I sent them to the color palette generator and got back some ideas that you saw over here. And one of my favorite things that is, I don't know how known this is, but let's say if I want to actually, let me draw a block here. And I'm kind of liking that green, so I'm going to take the sampler and sample the green. I really like that, so I'm going to throw that into my color palette. This is how, I mean, it's how I figure out gradients. If I see a gradient I like, copy it, bring it into the product, sample it. So on Windows, you'll have to get a utility that gives you the RGB, but same thing goes, you can actually build a color palette in there. And so once you find these colors, and in this case it was kind of a set of browns, a set of highlights, a set of action colors. There's a really kind of interesting trick for the non-color savvy. How do I come up with some of these gradients, or how do I come up with these values? Well, in this case, this gradient here, I actually took this darkest color and I put it in the gradient, and this actually I ended up separating out, but I took it from the dark to white. And then what you can see is that you can just pick a couple of points in those gradients, and that'll give you some nice colors that you can work with based on one color that you've picked. So I mean, it's not always going to give you quite the right saturation or quite level of black, but it doesn't. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a starting point, right? So you can get there. So that's a quick way to do that. Does everybody know how the gradient tool works? You want to quickly make one of these? I'll quickly make one. So the gradient, and again, I'm sampling if I want green, and then let's say I actually want, oops, I want my other color, my end point here to be white, right? Okay, so what you can see on this screen is actually, before I've gone in and started even doing my layout, I have my wireframes, I know where I'm going with it, but I haven't started doing my layout. I start to come up with a set of elements that I'm going to use. So in this case, I built on a theme, and this one, actually, let me see, I can't remember exactly. This one is built on Cool Gray Touch, so I knew it was going to be a touch, so I wanted the fonts to be there for me, and it's built on Cool Gray, and I decided that I was going to make some changes, and that's okay. I know people have talked a lot about, are my layouts going to get heavier and heavier, and we're using as much of the basic theme as possible, and we're adding a couple of changes to a couple of the slots that become local styles. It's really not going to be a substantial difference. The bigger difference is going to happen when you start to group things. That's going to make much bigger difference than actually putting a local style on something. So feel free to experiment with this. But what I would say is, come up with the elements that you like, and then when possible, rely on the copy-paste style. So use the format painter or use copy-paste styles, because it's going to just simplify your life a lot. So if I draw an element here, and I want it to look like this button, this is the copy style, and this is the paste style. It's really quick. And so once you have a library of elements, you can copy-paste styles across it, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel each time. So let's see, what else are we going to talk about here? Oh, we were going to talk about gradients here. So let's go, oh, right, it's in this one. So in this visual design file that gives you some ideas for the grids, we went in and played with some gradients. And you can see here that there are lots of different ways you can make a gradient, and they read different ways. And so I just put some cheaters in here for what does the gradient look like. And why would you use a gradient? Well, you can see most of these are heavier than the other elements. And so you can use it, say, to create a framework for a page, or you could use it to maybe bring an action forward to look pressable, or to jump out at somebody. Or it might be that you use a subtle gradient for the first part of each chunk of your solution, right? So it's going to help you create a rhythm because of the density and a little bit heavier visual weight. Now we're going to talk a little bit about actually laying out these fields and the field grouping and the individual corners. And so we know that our brains are looking for pattern and looking for rhythm. And so one of the things that we can do is, instead of putting more boxes around things or putting like a solid behind a group, we can actually just use the lack of corners and put fields together to just create inherent groups. Something you're seeing here, right? So I laid out the whole page on the grid, but once I got down to the field level, the grid was no longer working for me, and that's okay. I turned it off and stopped snapping to it. What I did was I wanted to make sure that my heights in between fields were consistent, and so a trick that I think I've used forever, mostly because I don't ever get to know tools like Photoshop well enough to figure it out the right way, but something I do a lot in FileMaker is actually I just create a little element that gives me the common spacing, and then I use that throughout the page just to move it around and make sure things are common spaces. Because again, if there's a difference in space, your brain's gonna go, well, does that mean something? Should I pay attention to that? I'm not sure. What does it mean? Choosing fonts is about legibility and readability, and it's about the environment, the audience, and where you're gonna be consuming it. So there are just some rules of thumb, right? When you have a sans serif, you have something technical or crisp or clean or youthful. And then when you have a serif, it's gonna be a little more conservative or traditional. One of the things here that I went through and did was, in this visual design file, is actually kind of organize the fonts in some different ways, because some fonts work pretty well with FileMaker across Mac and Windows. And so this actually organizes the fonts by FileMaker cross-platform friendliness, right? So Tahoma is used in the themes, and the reason for that is it's the least different between Mac and Windows. Just the way Mac and Windows render those fonts. The baselines won't jump around, the heights won't change as much. This is the one that's the most stable. Arial and Helvetica, Trebuchet, these are kind of ranked by stability across platform. Okay, Verdana. People talk to me about Verdana, and I hate Verdana. But it's not a personal thing. It's, Verdana is really wide, and its ascenders and descenders, like the H ascender and the G descender, they're really squatty, right? And so again, your brain is looking for outliers in order to quickly read, right? And so the squattier the font, the harder it's gonna be for you to read. So Verdana ends up kind of being a really bad font to use if you wanna read it quickly. So just something to keep in mind. It also does not render well across Mac and Windows in a FileMaker solution. So I organized a lot of like fonts, iOS fonts, and then just kind of looked at, how do they relate to one another? How much wider do they get? Just so that you can get a sense of which one might I pick. And things like font combinations, if you want to do something where you use a sans serif and a serif, what combinations work together well. So this is just the subset of fonts that you can expect to be on both Mac and Windows, and then on the iOS layouts, they're the ones that iOS will have, and you can expect your users will be able to see. Also the numeric columns, since we deal with a lot of data in FileMaker. Just some things to note, some of the numbers are easier to read than others. Tahoma turns out to have pretty clean numbers in columns, and things like Georgia, where the numbers are actually different baselines, just not as easy to read quickly. Okay, so I'm just gonna do a little bit of the after here, and just doing the scan test. And the fact that it jumps over to the right is actually not a problem. Yeah, that's the right. It's not a problem because that chunk is done at one time, and then when they come back in, they actually look for those smaller chunks, right? So they're good targets that you can come in and out of the system on. All right, I'm gonna show you this other case study. This was a really fun one. So this is Cal Poly. It's sports physicians and trainers who take care of the athletes. It's been used for a very long time. Here are the before. This is the before dashboard. This is one of the before screens. This is the one we're gonna focus on. So you can see there are really 3 activity screens. I like that there's, they're being differentiated by color. I wouldn't have chosen those colors. So we applied the theme, just cool gray, basic cool gray. And at that point, it's like, all right, well, we're not doing anything structural. We're just doing some broad stroke changes here. So the next thing was, well, what if we actually grouped that first column of fields, right? So from here, it's just like the okay, so I kind of feel tired just doing that, but it's like, how do I understand this, and how am I gonna move through these chunks of information? So from this to grouping them topically. You see what a difference that makes? And then one of the next things was, before I grouped them, I actually went through and was like, well, what if I added some bold? Would that help certain things stand out? What if I added some color? Would that help some things stand out? It was kind of, it's like being at the eye doctor, right? And they're like, better, worse, better, worse. It's a really, that's a good way to work. And you might go, better, okay, stop. And that's fine. So let's just do a quick full makeover. Just gonna do a quick recap of the whole process end to end. Ready? Okay. Decision grid, who is this gonna be? Physicians, therapists, athletes, we want sporty, we want professional. We know that Cal Poly is green and gold. They're gonna be in the bright office, they might be in the field, it might be daytime, it might be nighttime. So probably a dark on light theme, since we learned our lesson from the aqua solution. And we wanna have really clear edges, because one of the things that's happening here is that the physician is interacting with the patient. So what we learn from how are these people gonna be using it, they're actually setting the iPad down, which probably means it's gonna be in landscape, because that's generally how you fold back the case to set it down, right? Doctor's setting it down because he's interacting with the patient, right? 2 hands, so it's probably gonna be moving back and forth, big tap zones, nice clear boundaries, so I know what to target and tap. and the top task, just so that we can make sure that once we come up with a design that we're able to do those top tasks really quickly. Again, with the wireframes, this was a much more complicated system, but it's still based on the same underlying grid. Whether we ended up using that grid for, how are the columns in the list view organized versus how are the screens from one to the next organized. It's really important at this point that you look at the screens and you take a step back and you go, okay, well, it's one thing to be consistent where everything's narrow on the left and wide on the right. But if everything's narrow on the left and wide on the right, am I going to start to get lost from screen to screen? So should I mix it up? Just something to think about as you're making those decisions. So these were the original wireframes. We knew that we wanted quick access to the athletes. We wanted quick access to the injuries or a new one, because we just wanted to say new and say what's going on, or whatever daily treatments were going on. The list, we knew that we wanted to have a call out for whatever the current injuries were. This then got added onto, which call out for any kind of critical medical information. And then the wireframe. And you probably notice that between the original and this, we decided that the event was actually the most critical information to see all at once. It's like, who's the athlete and what has happened? And then the assessment and details were something that could probably follow on. And so rather than stuffing it all in one screen, we decided to optimize for that one task case and then put the secondary tasks as secondary parts of the screen. So when you're telling me, but they have to see everything all at once, it's like, really? Do they? Really? All 800 fields all at once? Color palette, gold and green. Looked at the website, looked at the marketing materials, looked at the logo. That's a great way to just draw some color, and you can just start sampling from these assets in order to come up with the palette. Or put it through the generator and come up with the palette. Build a quick grid. I'm going to be using my 18-point touch type font sizes, and I know I'm going to be optimizing for landscape, and so there's my quick grid. Those things at the bottom there, it's just like, well, if I want to have a 2x2 or if I want to have 4, and then I divided it by 3. I wasn't quite sure, but knew that we wanted to have a narrow to wide for the detail pages. And so here's the after, right? Really clear tap targets for the most important information. Really clean list where the critical information was popping out and being able to see the athlete's face, since we had that information in the database. And then the injury report. Data entry, but also, quick button right there, kind of where if you're holding the iPad, like right there at your thumb, so you can tap on the record button. And I'm just going to quickly move over in here, and so I hadn't opened it yet. Sports makeover. I'll just quickly go through this, right? Because it's really in here. All these things are really being done in here. Come up with the palette of elements. Just looking at different gradient treatments, just playing around, finding I like this brown color, and so what might a nice gradient be that works with it? A green color, okay, Cal Poly, brown and green and gold. This green actually in the Cal Poly logo is a little bit dull, but one of these actions to really stand out, so just brighten them up a bit, because again, your brain is looking for difference. And put the dashboard in, the lists in. I had to make a little bit of a difference here from the original vision, just so that the list view would actually work. You can see that the corners are a little bit rounded amongst one another rather than being a solid block. That's okay, it works. Oops. Report. One of the things that I wanted to point out while we're in here is that when you're using the guides, some people say, well, I have to set up my guides and I have to use them on every screen. And it actually turns out that I tend to turn them on and off a lot. It's great to learn some of these keyboard shortcuts for being able to turn them on, turn them off. But a lot of times, I don't want a guide in my way all the time. And so I'm looking at this and it's like, well, I don't know, this is kind of weird. This has to be called out and nice and bright, but what do I line this up with? I actually just kind of grab it and I go, okay, I should probably line treatments up with that, right? And then I put it away, right? Same thing over here. It's like, well, what's going on? I don't know. Should I change that around, or is that good enough? Things like that, you can make decisions. Let's see, I'm going to bring up the Aqua just for a second and show you a similar thing here, because let's actually go back to a layout with a reasonable font. As you get down into some of this detail, down here, it's like, well, how do I line this up? I mean, it's not going to fit in that exact grid system. And so what I look for is something that it can line up with, right? So comments lines up with those fields above it. The amount lines up with those labels above it. The label actually lines up with the fields above it, the data above it. And looking at this, I'm thinking, you know what? I actually kind of wish that we had moved these things over so that that field data lined up, just because it's going to be heavier and it will fit better with it. Right? So these are some of the things that you can look at as you get more and more detailed. Find something that it can match with so that your brain knows, okay, that's part of this row, or that's part of this section, or it's not so much of an outlier that it's like, emergency, oh wait, no, that's just another field. And so I think, yes, I've come to the end. Thank you.